Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So we have Fox News criticized after stock ticker removed during Trump tariff tumble from TVInsider.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crosswords from the economics subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't. I personally think Fox News is for trying to play defense for Trump, but when it comes to playing defense for an incumbent president, we just had 4 years of most of the other major news channels just playing defense for Joe Biden, and Reddit didn't care. The legacy media denied Biden's mental health issues until they literally couldn't anymore after the June 2024 debate, when it became clear to everyone that he was far gone and pretty much basically senile. But Reddit doesn't care about that. Reddit only cares because as I say in a lot of episodes, it's really just who's in the out group, who's in the in group. Joe Biden's in the in group, so Reddit, of course, is gonna defend anything Biden and his administration did. Well, Trump's in the out group, so Reddit will find any way whatsoever to attack and belittle Trump and his administration and any media that supports him. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump shares post about how he's purposely crashing the stock market from RollingStone.com, and that's from posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally don't really care for Trump, but after 35 I think it's been like almost 3,500 days of Orange Man bad just over on Reddit constantly. Eventually, we start to get numb to it. As I said, Reddit will always find a way to attack Trump. Even if it's just Trump doing a shit post on social media. Reddit will always find a way to say, oh, this is the world. This is literally the end of the world. And Reddit always is acting like it's the end of the world because of Orange Man or COVID or whatever the current thing is. But nothing really ever happens, despite social media pretty much saying, oh, the world's ending. Eventually, you get used to it, and yeah, you just can't let social media run your life like it seems to do for a lot of Redditors. Then we have Donald Trump is a lot dumber than we thought, like a lot, from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, that's another Orange Man bad post from a DNC news source like New Republic. And yeah, eventually, you just you get kind of tired of it. Reddit's pretty much just, normally I see MSNBC as Fox News for the DNC, shit for the DNC, but Reddit is right up there as being another one. It's pretty much just Fox News at this point, only as an online news aggregator. And that's just goes every subreddit at this point, like 90% of the subreddits just decided they wanted to be our politics clones, and this is one of them. Then we have Obama. Imagine if I had done any of this. Imagine if I had pulled Fox News' credentials from the White House press court. It's unimaginable that the same parties that are silent now would have tolerated behavior like that from me or a whole bunch of my predecessors. Posted by Donald Key, and that's crossword from the 5051 subreddit. And yeah, Obama's not a guy I agree with on every issue. I don't agree with especially a lot of economic issues, I would say, but I would agree with him here. He's pretty much saying what I usually say. It's just who's in the in group, who's in the out group. A lot of people who would be raging if Obama did a lot of stuff Trump did, are quiet right now. But you have the reverse of that as well. A lot of people who are quiet, who are raging right now, were quiet when Obama did a lot of horrible stuff as well. Like when he bombed Libya. Or, when he, went after Edward Snowden. But, they tried to justify that since their figurehead was in power rather than the opposing figurehead. And that just goes to show you, a lot of people don't really have values or principles. They just have in-group and out-group. Then we have Trump's tariffs are designed to collapse our democracy. Chris Murphy, from Donald P., and that's crossovers from the Chris Murphy subreddit. And yeah, Chris Murphy, not another dude I care for. I personally don't really care for Trump's tariffs, but that they're just the current thing. Eventually, people will move on to the next current thing. I personally am very against tariffs as a whole. because I'm not very big into taxes, because I think everything should be voluntary. So I think if people want to pay taxes, they should be able to. But they shouldn't be forced to pay taxes if they want to. And tariffs are just a tax on imported goods. And so I'm personally against the tariffs. But with that being said, the Democrats are using this just as an excuse to promote themselves rather than being principled against terrorists. I'm sure if Reddit, I'm sure if Joe Biden did the exact same tariffs that Trump did, Reddit would be hailing them as the greatest thing ever. So it's just you gotta stick to your principles. You just can't say, oh, you're good, you're bad. Like Reddit does. Reddit has a very binary mentality, which is interesting for someone who thinks, for a lot of people who think, oh, gender's fluid, everything's fluid, but you can't be politically fluid on Reddit because, it's either you agree with the Democrats and you're a good person, or you agree with Trump and the Republicans and you're bad, or you're a bad person. And if you're an independent, they might as well just throw you with the Trump people because, if you disagree with them from the official DNC narrative at all, they'll throw all the names to you in the book, like Hitler, Nazi, fascist, etc., etc. And eventually, you get tired of that. You just realize they have nothing to do but throw names at you, and just shows you, that it just shows you that when someone just resorts to name calling, you're winning the argument. And Reddit can name call, Reddit can downvote, but that you just can't let that change your beliefs because you gotta stand firm to your beliefs. If you want to change your mind, that's fine, but you just can't change your mind because Reddit says something. And or Chris Murphy in this instance, he's the one saying, "Oh, Trump's tariffs are designed to collapse our democracy." You just can't. I'm personally against Trump's tariffs, but I don't want Chris Murphy telling me what to do either. He seems like very much a Reddit politician. Just circle jerk your own ideas and have everyone agree with you and share them on social media. And Donald Trump's really bad at that as well, but Reddit at least realizes Donald Trump is a grifter. They don't realize a lot of the Democratic politicians are the exact same grifter. Then we have, don't forget where your private property land came from CH4 Locks, and that's cross was from the Interesting as Fuck subreddit, How Can They Own Our Land, from Hells on Wheels series. And I guess, a lot of Redditors, they will say, the natives used to own this land, it should be theirs. But history is full of people stealing and taking land, and sometimes you just have to cope with it. Ultimately, as I always like to say, all governance is ultimately whoever has the force to do what. That's why it's very important that the government has a monopoly on the legal use of force, and because that's the key to its legitimacy. Because I'm not really a might makes right person, but that's ultimately how the world operates. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have something about a broken clock being right from Ragnarok KXG, and that's a YouTube video from Pitchfork Economics, Ronald Reagan on tariffs. And I used to say that the Republicans were the more libertarian party when it came to economics. But since 2012, it seems like they've adopted the libertarian position is for free trade. But since 2012, it seems like the Republican Party's adopted a more protectionist outlook, and I don't think that's very libertarian, even if it might be well intentioned. For protectionist tariffs, they might be well-intentioned to encourage people to buy local, but I do think they go against free trade, which is a libertarian key value. And at the same time, I would say the Democrats used to be the more social libertarian party, but then they went down the path of hyper-political correctness and woke, and now they're not very socially libertarian anymore. And that just goes to show you, people might say, "Oh, I'm libertarian," but then they'll say, it might be, I want to force all my values on people or take away their right to free trade, and that just goes to show you how both parties might say they're libertarian, but they'll justify whatever they want to justify since they are in a position of power, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have what if the high tariffs were an object lesson in the evils of taxes from Spare Simeon, and they said tariffs are taxes, taxation is theft. So what if now that everyone has seen the error of their ways, and at the height of tax season Trump repealed all tariffs and taxes, imagine all the money dropping from the consumers and businesses' hands, imagine a tax refund of all your withheld income tax, and yeah, I personally don't really care if I would agree with that. Reddit, but Reddit, they love taxes. You can tell because this post is downvoted. It's only 25% upvoted currently, and yeah, it just goes to show you that Reddit might hate tariffs, but they might say it for a principal position, but they really just don't like them because Trump's doing them. If Biden was doing them, they'd love them. That's why the trade war with China was bad during Trump's first term, but then it was fine during Biden's term. But now that Trump's president again, it's the worst. It's bad again. So yeah, tariffs are bad, taxes are bad, but Reddit, they only care because Orange Man's the one doing them. They don't have any. They love taxes. They love big government. But the only reason they don't like the government currently is because the out-group's in power rather than the in-group. Then we have the tax prep industry would rather risk prison from Spare Simeon, and they said bills to allow the IRS to prohibit taxes keep popping up, but the tax prep industry keeps shooting them down for strong lobbying. And then they linked to a YouTube video, filing taxes U.S. versus France from Roya Ventura. And yeah, I do think it's I personally don't really like taxes, and they do seemingly make it as complicated as possible to pay them. So, it just goes to show you how, I think the libertarian position is to get rid of taxes altogether and abolish the IRS, but ultimately, the government has the force to do whatever it wants to. If you pay your taxes, the government can say, well, we still have the force to arrest you because you didn't pay them the correct way. And that just goes to show you how, the government, when it has a monopoly on the legal use of force, they can justify doing whatever they want to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have video shows aid workers killed in Gaza under gunfire bebarrage with ambulance lights on from nytimes.com, post from Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, being anti-Israel is probably one of the positions I would agree with the progressives on. I don't think the U.S. should be giving money to any other country it should be keeping all its money, government money and tax money inside its own borders. But, the government will justify whatever it wants to justify, I don't like how Trump's up Netanyahu's ass, but, a lot of people say Trump's a Russian asset, but I would say the real thing is he's much more of an Israeli asset than a Russian one. The Israel lobby is arguably the most powerful lobby in a town chock full of them, and they pretty much the IPAC pretty much runs Congress. Thomas Massey came out against them, and then his wife just dropped dead. So it just goes to show you that they would probably Trump and a lot of the Republicans would probably call that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. But when you want to label anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism, that just goes against free speech. It's just like that's just like woke censorship. Only it's the Republicans doing it instead of the Democrats. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Biden checks his watch while soldiers' remains are arriving and Fox News freaks out. I'm sure they'll have a lot to say about Trump going golfing when they arrive. From Donald Key, and that's from the centrist subreddit. And yeah, it's just as I always say, who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. Then we have They Really Don't Want Us to Vote from Tom 13, and that's from the Woman in News subreddit. And yeah, I'm sure that it was some bill that said, this will make it easier for married women to vote. There's probably some other shit in there. So, Reddit's always says, the Republicans are literally Hitler. And I personally don't care for the Republicans. If I had any problem with them, it's that they're too far left. They're pretty much just controlled opposition. But of course, Reddit, they'll find some bill that they didn't vote the right way on. They'll say, this is why Republicans are really Hitler, even if, context is important. But, Reddit, they don't let context get in the way of a good narrative. Then we have Judge to Trump. Yes, you really do have to undo lawless deportation to El Salvador from RollingStone.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, ultimately, if the judges want to hold Trump in check, they should be able to do so. But, it ultimately comes down to who's the force to do what. It's like Andrew Jackson said after John Marshall ruled against him when it came to the Trail of Tears. Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. Ultimately, it's whoever controls the use of force rather than what the courts say. Sometimes the courts might have control of force because, they're a branch of the government. Sometimes it might be the president, and sometimes it might be the Congress, but it ultimately does. It only doesn't matter who's in what position of authority. It matters who is willing to justify the legal use of force to do what. And you see that when it comes to the El Salvador deportations. I personally think we need due process for everyone in the U.S., even if I do think also that a lot of people being deported to El Salvador probably deserve for being gang members and just general low-life thugs. But, you do need due process, but ultimately the government can justify deporting people if it wants to, since it has the legal monopoly on the use of force. Then we have stupid VAT tax rules in the Philippines from YouTube.com, and that's a YouTube video from John Dank posted by Spare Simeon, and they added coming to a country near you. And yeah, Reddit always seems to act like America's a uniquely bad country. Well, in reality, tons of other countries have stupid laws, but Reddit's just an primarily American-based website, so of course they'll only care about America. And yeah, that's just Reddit circle jerk. Reddit, it says, "Oh, I love all the world's countries," but they only seem to focus on the U.S., maybe occasionally Canada and Europe as well. And that just goes to show you how, Reddit might say it's a worldly website, but, they only seem to care about what's directly affecting them. Then we have Trump says he would be honored by El Salvador taking American citizens and putting them in federal prison population from CH4Locks, and that's crosswords from the r/law subreddit, and that's a clip of Trump on Fox News. And yeah, another Orange Man bad post. We'll just skip over this one because I already talked enough about that. Then we have, never thought I'd be quoting Reagan on economics in this timeline from Ragnar OKXG, and that's a quote from Ronald Reagan. "We should beware of the demagogues who are willing to declare a trade war against our friends, weakening our economy, our national security, and the entire free world, all while cynically waving the American flag." And yeah, I personally would agree with that. Ronald Reagan, I think, was personally a worse president than Trump was. But Trump's kind of the current thing right now, so Reddit has to be anti-Trump. And they'll even agree with Reagan because, Reagan might have been the worst thing of the 1980s, but Trump's the worst thing of right now. Maybe in the 2060s, they'll be quoting Trump against the current president because, Reddit, they always move the goalpost as to who the worst thing ever is. If Trump leaves office in 2029, then another Republican takes office like J.D. Vance or something, suddenly Vance will be the worst thing ever. Back in the 2000s, it was Bush. Back in the 80s, it was Reagan. They always find a boogeyman. Back when it looked like Ron DeSantis looks like he could take the Republican nomination. He was the worst thing ever. It's just whoever they deem to be the biggest threat of the Republican Party is deemed as the biggest threat, the worst thing ever, even if they would quote them against the current biggest thing ever, like they're doing with Reagan here. Or from worst thing ever, I should say. Then we have AOC calling this presidency like it is from Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosswords from the White People Twitter subreddit. And that's a tweet from a Blue Sky post from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, woke Twitter, Blue Sky. And she says, ChatGPT asked presidency, and that was her quote tweeting Philip Heimberger. Incredible. The Trump administration called calculated tariff rates by taking the U.S. trade deficit with the respective country and dividing it by the country's exports to the U.S. And then the tariff rate the U.S. is often just sent by cutting that made up tariff rate in half. And yeah, I don't really like AOC. She's kind of an annoying social media politician like Trump, only instead of being in the out group, she's in the in group when it comes to Reddit. And yeah, but I definitely would agree with her statement here. They pretty much just use ChatGPT to generate the tariff rates, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. Personally, I don't think the tariff rates should be there at all. But I definitely think you should probably do more to make them than just use ChatGPT. But ultimately, the people who are in power will justify whatever they justify. I'm sure if Joe Biden used ChatGPT at any point for any of his policies, Reddit would say, "Well, he's a busy man. He's got to do something. He's got to make those policies somehow," and they would completely justify it. Then we have Trump orders 4-mile military parade for his 79th birthday from the dailybeast.com by CH4Locks. And yeah, I don't really care for this. That's just another way for Trump to throw away money and jerk himself off. But that's pretty much all the politicians do. But Reddit only seems to care that Trump does it. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.